Good morning. Let's not talk about last night. Let's talk about the week ahead instead, and it might be tricky.
Nurses' voices have been not heard and just overlooked for such a long time now.
So in the first action of its kind, nurses will swap the wards for the picket line. Ambulance drivers too will join the growing ranks on strike.
What do we want? CFP. When do we want it? Now.
In a bitterly cold winter, no more hope of a win in Qatar to cheer us up. Union leader after union leader up for the fight.
We, like nurses and teachers and paramedics, have no option other than to take industrial action because our members currently are skipping meals, not being able to put the heating on at home.
But the government says the country hasn't got the cash for more pay. The Prime Minister talking tough about what they might do.
It's right now that we also look to minimise the disruption on people's lives, and that's why we're looking at tough new laws.
Yet we have one big question this morning. What's the government doing right now to stop strike chaos for us all?
Strikes, Strep A, serious pressures. The medical director of NHS England, Professor Steve Powis, is here. Can the health service really cope? And how will the government manage serious problems at home and abroad? For the first time, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is here in the studio. And the Shadow Health Secretary will be with us too, Wes Streeting, a man tipped to be a future Prime Minister. And with me at the desk throughout to help us chew over what they all have to say, who better than the leader of the Nurses' Union going on strike, Pat Cullen, the chairman of Asda and Conservative member of the Lords, Stuart Rose, and the historian, presenter and author, Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's just completed a family history of nothing less than the whole world. Hello and a very warm welcome to you. Now, a couple of weeks ago, you might remember, we asked on the show if we were heading for a winter of discontent. I'm afraid it rather seems as if it's here. Let's look at the front pages. Two different kinds of misery. Of course, the defeat in Qatar last night. Let's not dwell on that. But lots of the newspapers already talking about the strikes. The Daily Express there saying the Christmas strikes could cost £4 billion. Now, Pat Cullen is here, who is the leader of the Nurses' Union. Pat, if nothing changes, your members are going to walk out in the first action of its kind ever. And yet this morning's Observer, I want to show our viewers, seems to hint that you might be willing to give some ground. Are you changing your position?
Our position hasn't changed, absolutely not. But what I'm saying is that the Health Secretary can choose negotiation over picket lines. So my door's open for him to come in through. And if he doesn't want to speak to me in a one-to-one, what I'm offering him this morning is conciliation through ACAS. And we can start to do that tomorrow morning at whatever time he wants to be available at. And that's really, really important.
But this morning in the Observer, we can see up there, it seems to suggest that you are willing now to give some ground. Are you accepting that your original demand for 15% of a pay increase is too high?
Well, I'm not going to negotiate on the airwaves, Laura, definitely not. But as soon as the Health Secretary gets into a room with me, whether that's through conciliation or on a one-to-one, I'll certainly not be found wanting in my negotiations.
So you would give some ground on that original demand?
I'm not saying I wouldn't. And I certainly, as I said during the week, I won't dig in if he doesn't dig in.
OK, so you're indicating some flexibility there?
Well, look what happened in Scotland when the First Minister asked to meet with me. And it was on a Friday, and by Friday evening we had suspended our strike dates for Scotland. So that's, again, very much demonstrating we aren't for digging in. That's not what nurses do, and I'm a nurse. So come on, let's have the discussions and let's have the negotiation.
But in Scotland, though, there was a less generous offer from the government than your original demand. I just want to be really clear on this from our viewers. You're saying this morning you would accept less than you've been asking for so far in order to be able to pause these strikes?
No, what I've said is come to the table and let's have the discussion.
OK. Stuart Rose, what do you make of what's going on here? I mean, in your very extensive business career, you've also had to deal with industrial action, but how do you think the government's handling this?
Well, listen, I was married to a nurse for 25 years, so I know how hard nurses work and I know how tough it is. I did a report for the NHS back 7 years ago, and I was on the front line, and I recognise the tough times that we've got. But listen, I'm a great believer that each of these issues that we've got with strikes needs to be dealt with on a one-to-one basis. I think that each needs to be looked at its own merits. The nurses do have a case, but let's look at it in a slightly different way, if I might. We've had 4 events in the last 10 years. We've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the global financial crisis, and we had Brexit. And these things have all conspired to make very tough times for us, and we can't solve the whole problem in 1 minute. So my answer would be, let's sit down, let's negotiate, but let's do what's possible.
Can I ask you also about something else, just briefly? Asda's got lots and lots of pharmacies around the country. We know lots of pharmacies are reporting shortages of the antibiotics that people want for their families to help cope with Strep A. What's going on? Is there a real shortage?
Well, there is a shortage. I mean, I think the answer would be we're thinner than we'd like. We're coping. We've got about 250 pharmacies, but it's okay. But we need to make sure that people are reassured that those stocks are available, but we'll get through it.
OK, we'll ask the NHS boss about that in just a second. But Sebag, as a historian, do you think the moment we're in, a lot of the newspapers this morning are suggesting this is sort of a moment of decline, a moment of great disruption, a bit like the 1970s. Do you think that's right?
No, I don't. I think one has to look at it in a different way. I think the crisis of the 70s was systemic about the way British industry worked. But this is a much bigger crisis. This is a crisis of the comfort democracies, as I call them. The expectations that our countries will be able to afford pay rises and massive benefits for people. And of course, this is in the end something faced by all the democracies, all the democracies in Europe and the States, of course, and North America. And it's something we have to sort out, or it will threaten our democracies themselves.
Very interesting. Well, maybe we'll pick that up with the Foreign Secretary a bit later on, but you all stay there. Hard work for you guys in the next 50 minutes or so. So let's talk about the strikes. That's one on most people's minds. Nurses, as we've heard, in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are due to strike on the 15th and the 20th of December. 10,000 ambulance workers, including paramedics, are out in most of England and Wales on the 21st and the 28th. And in a minute, we'll hear from the NHS, but let's fill in the rest of not a very happy calendar. Look at this over the rest of the month. Things could be very tricky because border staff will be striking for 8 days over Christmas and New Year. Posties are taking action too, as are rail workers, teachers, university staff, baggage handlers, bus drivers and driving examiners too. You can see we're in for a difficult few weeks. If you want to get anything done, December the 12th might be the best day. But without further ado, Professor Steve Powis, who's the Medical Director of NHS England, is here with us this morning. What did you make hearing Pat Cullen there? Do you think there is a chance these strikes might be called off?
Well, obviously that's a matter for the Secretary of State and for Pat and the unions. But I think for us in the NHS, we've been preparing for the industrial action that begins this week for some time. We're working hard to make sure that we keep our patients safe on strike days and that we continue to provide the best possible care we can under the circumstances. We've asked local hospitals to contact patients in advance if their care is going to be disrupted. So the message here is clear. If you don't hear that your procedure or appointment is going to be rescheduled, then please do turn up as you normally would. But
you're a clinician yourself. I know you don't want to get into the politics of the strike, but do you understand why your colleagues in the NHS feel they have to walk out? Well, our staff are under huge pressure at the moment. They've had a really difficult 3 years with the pandemic, and I know many of them will have agonised over whether they should tick the box for industrial action or not. Our job, of course, is to support them, whether they're taking action or not. But, of course, pay is a matter for the independent pay review bodies. It's a matter for the government. But I, like everybody else, would like these disputes to be resolved as quickly as possible. And I think many of our viewers this morning will be really worried about what might lie ahead. We know people are already waiting a long time, not always getting the care that they would like. Will patients be safe in hospital on the strike days? Well, as I say, we're working hard to ensure that patients are safe. Everybody in the NHS wants patients to be safe. Remember, emergency services will be maintained. So if you have a life-threatening condition, then please do continue to call 999. And for non-life-threatening conditions, then 111 online should be your first port of call. Important to remember that the majority of hospitals in England are not affected by strike action this Thursday. And primary care, that's general practice, dentistry and pharmacy, is also unaffected. But let me be clear, Laura,
our services will be disrupted on Thursday.
And what that means, when you talk about the health service, disruption means patients suffering. And it might mean people suffering quite badly unnecessarily. Is it the case you think that people might lose their lives as a result of the strikes?
Well, nobody in the NHS wants that.
No one wants that, but let's be really clear. You're saying services will be disrupted. If a health service is disrupted, that could jeopardise life, couldn't it?
Well, as I say, we've been working hard and talking with union representatives at national level and at local level to ensure those emergency services remain open, and also other key services. So this Thursday, for instance, kidney dialysis and chemotherapy. And those conversations will continue. But I'm confident that all our staff in the NHS care deeply about their patients and will want to keep them safe and protected.
But do you have an idea of how many procedures might be cancelled? I mean, there are all sorts of numbers out there. There was a suggestion there might be 15,000 procedures that don't go ahead. Is there a number you can share with people this morning?
I don't think it's possible to put a number on it at the moment. We will need to wait until the action occurs on Thursday and see what disruption occurs. But remember, as I said, the majority of hospitals in England are not being affected this Thursday.
In terms of the potential in the next few months, though, it's possible that these strikes will go on for many months. We know already waiting lists, backlogs, ambulance waiting times are already at record levels in many cases. I mean, are you worried about the potential impact of this beyond this week?
Well, we have been making progress in the backlog that was caused by the pandemic. We hit our first milestone of reducing waits below 2 years in the summer of this year. And our ambition is to reduce waiting times below 18 months by the spring. Now, of course, that could be knocked off course. Industrial action is one thing that could knock it off course, but of course, could be a significant wave of COVID, new variant perhaps, and of course we could see a high peak of flu. So yes, there is trouble brewing this winter, and we will need to see how we get on.
So you are being open with us this morning. The NHS is getting back to normal, recovering from COVID, could be knocked off by this industrial action if it keeps going on for a long time.
Yes, well, the NHS has been under huge pressure, like many health services around the world. Now, why is that? Well, we're seeing record demand. For instance, in November, we saw more attendances at A&E than we have ever seen in that month. We are still dealing with COVID. We have around 6,000 patients in hospital in England at the moment with COVID, and we are entering our fifth wave of the year. We've had at times up to 15,000 patients with COVID. Flu has come early. Just in the last week, we've seen a near 50% increase in the number of patients in hospital with flu. And of course, we have other respiratory illnesses coming back, such as Group A strep.
And I want to talk to you about that in just a second, but I noticed there you said we are now entering a fifth wave of COVID.
Yes.
And you're still on alert for a new variant. And I think many of our audience will remember seeing you at those Downing Street briefings. You were one of the senior medics who fielded questions from the public as well as from journalists. Are you worried about another wave?
You know, when the pandemic started, I remember saying to a colleague that this will be at least 5 years getting through the effects of COVID. And so clearly we had those first few waves, and then the great scientific advances of the vaccines, the therapeutics, has meant it's a less severe disease now. But it can still affect people, and it can still affect people seriously. And as the new virus begins to adapt to its new human host, then you are getting these waves of infection. As I say, we're entering the fifth wave of this year. Now, eventually, we think it will become a seasonal infection, probably likeliest in the winter, but that hasn't happened yet. And of course, you know, like any natural disaster in a sense, there is a clear-up operation, and it will take us several years to get on top of the backlog and the disruption that occurred because of the virus.
Now, you mentioned Strep A there. Is there a shortage of antibiotics? You know, some families are really worried about this. Some children have died as a result of the infection. We heard from Stuart Rose there, a huge business like Asda isn't quite able to get the supplies that they want, or that they're having to try very hard. Is there a shortage of antibiotics?
Well, let me say first, it's not unusual to see cases of Group A strep at this sort of level. We've seen it in previous years. What's unusual this year is we're seeing it earlier. We're seeing it at the start of winter rather than when we usually see a peak at the end of winter. And that's why we've alerted parents, we've alerted our healthcare professionals to watch out for symptoms.
And what should people watch for then? Let's be really clear with parents particularly.
Well, again, to reassure, Group A strep is a mild infection in the vast majority of children. can cause non-specific symptoms such as a sore throat, can go on to develop scarlet fever, where you get a widespread rash, feels a little bit like sandpaper, swollen tongue, red, bumpy, so-called strawberry tongue. Best thing to do is to look at 111 online, where there's a list of symptoms and it gives advice as to the circumstances in which you should contact healthcare professionals. Antibiotics are the typical treatment for scarlet fever. We have plenty of antibiotics. Clearly, we've been asking people to prescribe them a little bit earlier. That means that pharmacies have needed extra supplies, so the government is working with wholesalers to make sure those supplies get out.
So is there or not a shortage? So you say there's enough in the big picture, but there's clearly, right now, we know from families, you know, coming to the press and saying they can't get it. We know that from social media. We know also of some prices really spiking for, you know, ordinary penicillin costs going through the roof. Is it, if it's a shortage in real life, even if there's not a shortage in the big picture, how do you fix that?
Yeah, you fix it by working with the wholesalers, the Department of Health working with the wholesalers who supply drugs to pharmacies. That's what's happening at the moment. As I say, we have asked our clinicians to have a slightly lower threshold for the use of antibiotics because cases have increased, and that means that we've got to restock pharmacies.
And are you confident, though, that every family, every child who needs antibiotics will be able to get it this winter?
Yes, so we're working hard, as I say, Department of Health working hard to ensure that those supplies come out from wholesalers into pharmacies. But I want to reassure people, as I said, this is a mild infection. The vast majority of cases can cause a severe illness, so-called IGAS, invasive group A strep, and unfortunately, as you know, we've had a few tragic deaths in the last few weeks.
How quickly, though, do you think you'll be able to get those antibiotics available where everybody needs them?
Oh, those supply chains work really well, so I would expect you will be seeing those supplies coming out to pharmacies literally as we speak.
Oh, in the next few days, we should be confident that problem disappears?
Yes, so there is a supply chain, there's a system in place, and Department of Health, as I say, working with wholesalers to get drugs out.
I just, as you're here, want to ask you about the sort of, you know, general state of the health service. We all know, and you've explained really clearly, the reasons why there is so much pressure. But as someone who's been a doctor for a long time, do you worry about the way things are going? You know, a few years ago, if somebody had died outside a hospital in an ambulance because they couldn't get into A&E, it would have been a huge scandal. Politicians would have been under enormous pressure to immediately fix that. There would have been a massive outcry. And yet now it seems we're hearing really desperate stories very regularly. I mean, as someone with all your years of experience, how do you describe the state of things right now?
Well, of course it's concerning, and the health system is under huge pressure, as I've explained. We've been planning for winter for many months. So, for instance, we've been increasing capacity with around 7,000 bed equivalents. So that includes things like virtual wards, so-called virtual wards in the community, where we can provide treatment and care at home that previously would have been provided in a hospital bed. We're increasing the number of 111 call handlers this winter. We're introducing local system control centres to manage the pressures between health systems and social care, and we're putting in a national fall service so that the frail and elderly who have a fall can be managed at home, get back on their feet and not have to go into hospital.
So you're trying all sorts of ways to cope with the pressure, but you know, we hear again and again, whatever the intention to get things right, you just can't get the staff to actually deal with the demand. I mean, how can we confront this problem with workforce? Is that what is at the heart of this problem?
Well, the NHS absolutely needs more staff. We have over 100,000 vacancies at the moment in the NHS in England, and if you compare us with neighbouring European countries, we have fewer doctors per head of the population. The government has asked us to produce a long-term workforce plan. We're working on that and hope to publish it in the spring, and that will lay out what we think we need. But if you ask me personally, for instance, when it comes to doctors, I think we need more medical school places. So I think as a first step, we should increase the number of medical student places by around 1,000 to 2,000. And I would deliberately create those places at existing or new medical schools in parts of the country where we have staff shortages, because we know people tend to put roots down in the areas where they train. And in fact, I think there's a growing consensus on this. The Chancellor, when he was chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, called for an increase in medical school numbers. And indeed, the Shadow Health Secretary, who I know you'll be talking to later, has also called for an increase. So I think there is an opportunity here to work to increase our trained workforce here in the UK.
And perhaps that's, in your view, the long-term change that would make the difference?
Yes, we obviously need to retain staff, we can recruit internationally, but ultimately we need to train more staff here in this country.
OK, Professor Powis, thank you so much for coming in this morning. Professor Sir Steve Powis, I think, actually, as of this week. Thanks so much for being with us this morning. Now, lots to digest in there. Let's get back over to our panel. And the leader of the Royal College of Nurses, Pat Cullen, is here this morning and I'm sure was listening intently. Steve Powis, one of the most senior NHS managers in the country, he's just told us that industrial action puts the recovery from COVID at risk. How do you answer that?
Well, I listened carefully to what Stephen had to say, and what he didn't say was that the 1 day of action that nurses are going to take on Thursday hasn't created the 7.2 million people sitting on our waiting lists. The NHS has been in crisis for many, many years. That hasn't been caused by nurses. In fact, what sort of a state would it be in if we didn't have those nurses working the additional unpaid hours they do, working every hour they can get in their day? And what are we doing with those people? We're paying them the lowest possible wage we can. In fact, international evidence brought out by the OECD last week shows, and this is despicable, that UK nurses are paid the lowest in Europe. Now, what way is that to run a country? What way is that to reward those people, those nurses that kept us going during the pandemic?
What do you say, though, to politicians and maybe some of our viewers this morning who also think we would love nurses to have very significant pay increases, but the country is hard up? There isn't the cash. What do you say to that?
I would say that nurses aren't greedy people. They definitely are not. But a nurse on £27,000 a year living in central London needs to be able to feed her children, be able to send them to school, look after them in creches so they can go to their work and pay their travel to go to work and also pay their utility bills. And they're not asking for an incredible pay rise. They're asking just to be able to make ends meet. That's what I would say to them. And if we want to retain our nurses in the system that we've got to do the things that Stephen talked about there now, we're going to have to do something.
Lord Rose, what do you say to that? I mean, you've had to deal with industrial action in your own business.
Public sector pay has not kept pace with private sector pay. And there's no doubt about it that there are some sectors of the public sector who are underpaid. There's no doubt about that. Nurses should get paid more money. The question is how much and how do we do that? Now, you've just heard from Steve that the National Health Service is facing yet another crisis. This is not a new crisis. It's not a crisis that will be sorted out in short order. I mean, you've got too many people trying to come in. You've got too few people coming out of the pipeline in terms of social care. We've got too many bureaucrats in the middle, and we haven't sorted the system out. So we have to do that. Now, Pat's people are part of that problem. So they're trying to sort it out. They're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for which they deserve all the credit. But we do have an issue, and it's moving to a slightly different place. I'm rather optimistic, because you need to be optimistic as a retailer, that we may just be passing the worst part of this current crisis.
What makes you think that?
I just think we know mathematically that inflation is come down next year. We know actually that we're probably not going to have the same sort of recession as we had caused by other things like the global financial crisis. We have a shortage of labour, and we have, I think, the opportunity with interest rates beginning to come down, the government trying to get to a soft landing, that we could get through this. We don't want to make this crisis any worse. So that might sound like me saying, look, hold on. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, be fair, take a long view, help the country, because we've all got to help each other at the moment. We could come out of the late summer to less of a recession than we thought we might have, and better times at the end of 23.
Except that I think for a lot of people watching this morning, whether they're nurses, other public sector workers preparing to go on strike, or indeed some of your own workers at Asda, Stuart, who the GMB union says are paid less than any other supermarket workers, they might think that hearing you this morning saying, oh, well, it's all going to be fine, they might think, well, that's a bit rich.
Well, I'm not saying it's all going to be fine. I'm saying it's going to be difficult, but it could be less bad. And we just need to be thoughtful about what we're asking for. Every case needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I think I tried to say earlier. Now, listen, I see it front line. In Asda, we are dealing with many of our customers who are finding it a struggle. People are trying to have a good Christmas. People are having to cut back. People are having to make decisions about what they can spend their money on and what they can't. Let's look after our children. Let's have a nice Christmas. Let's cut back on some of the other stuff, luxuries. And they're having to do that. And we know that our customers are something like £150 a week worse off than they were this time last year. So it is tough. All I'm saying is we don't want to put petrol on the fire.
and doom and gloom can sometimes talk you into something even worse.
Yes.
I just want to look at show people the Sunday Times this morning have described this period of industrial action as a new lockdown. Essentially, the country's going to be brought to a standstill, they claim. Pat, are you concerned about how the public might react to a prolonged period of strikes in all sorts of sectors? I think all the polling suggests, anecdotally, it seems to be the case, there's a lot of sympathy for nurses. But we are in a period where almost everywhere you look, there's industrial action on the way. Are you concerned about keeping the public on side?
Well, I would never take the public for granted. That's the first thing. And nurses don't take the public for granted. But I'm concerned for the public. I'm concerned for the public that can't get decent services, the services that they're entitled to. That's where my concern is. And what's the nurses' strike about? It's not about lining their pockets with gold. It's about standing up for their patients, wanting their patients to get a decent service, and filling the 50,000 vacant posts that we've got in the health service so that we can tackle those waiting lists, get those 2 million people seen in the right time and in the time that they deserve, so that they can then get back to contribute to the economy and society. That's what my concern's about. But I'll never take the public for granted, certainly as a nurse, and we won't throughout the strike either.
Sebag, what do you make hearing these arguments going on?
I mean, I'm a doctor's son, so I always support nurses and doctors. But I do think we need to look at this in a less short term. And one of the great sort of shortcomings of democracies in our present media world is that we look at everything in a very, very short term. But actually, populations are rising, older people are living longer. The NHS is a sort of 1940s bureaucracy in the 21st century. And so I think we need to do something we're very bad at, which is to plan ahead for higher migration, older populations. And that means a sort of new look at the NHS. It's a sacred organisation. It's almost our equivalent of the church in 21st century England. But we need to look at it. And it's very hard to reform a sacred institution, but that's what we need to do. We need to look ahead and think differently about the NHS, which in the future is not going to be able to do everything.
Now, talking of a sacred institution, let's talk about the royal family, because you won't have missed this morning either in the newspapers or all over Netflix, social media, everywhere this week. Harry and Meghan telling their version of events. And Sebag, you are familiar with the Windsor family, but you've also written in your new book an epic tome about the history of the whole world through families and dynasties. Now, one of the things you explore there is how powerful men and women deal with their children. And you've said sometimes they always find a way of humiliating them. Do you think that's what's happening here? I mean, are Harry and Meghan humiliating the royal family?
I don't think so. I think that the programme was actually very unexciting, somewhat boring. And though it was very portentous, it was deeply unmomentous. And I think I think that I've written this book about looking at the world history through dynasties, many of them royal. And I think one's got to have a sense of perspective here. I mean, when you were looking at the Ottoman family or the Mughal family in history, when they had a rebel prince, they often, I'm afraid, brought out the bowstring, or they trampled them with the elephant hooves. And I think that actually, one just have to, when one looks at Prince Harry and one looks at, an LA mansion, endless red carpet galas, and a reality show on Netflix, I think he hasn't really got that much to complain about.
That's interesting. And maybe in history, or should he be dealt with now, in modern times, more harshly than maybe he has been so far?
I think there's nothing to do. I think this changes very little. I think it's a fluffy reality show. And I think that I know the media go absolutely crazy about it. But actually, I think, we look at our monarchy today, it's in our strange constitution, it's the personification of democracy. We have a more wonderful monarch in Charles III, who is a model of duty and service and thoughtfulness. In many ways, we're very lucky to have him, and I think that I really think this rather unexciting Netflix phenomenon will pass fast, and I think it will make very little difference.
Have you all watched it though? I saw you nodding along.
I've certainly not watched it, but it's much ado about nothing. I think it's a lot of puff, and I think Simon's point about, you know, we should be grateful we've got a monarchy because we could have an elected head of state, which I think we'd like less. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, he should just pass away and do something different.
OK, Pat, you're raising your eyebrows there.
Yeah, look, the first thing is I haven't watched it, but and the late monarch has been our patron from 1953.
The Royal College of Nursing.
In the Royal College of Nursing, and has added much to the lives of our nurses. And we're sincerely hoping that His Royal Highness will be our next patron. And we have got the Prince of Wales Cadet Scheme in the Royal College of Nursing. But what I would say is when families become fractured as a mental health nurse, the only way back is to try and rebuild, because there's nothing to be gained from fractured families. Families are stronger together, in my opinion, and I think it's sad to see that fracture as it sits at the minute.
Health.
And it's exactly, yeah, absolutely. There's comparisons there.
OK, all right, all three of you, thank you very much for now. I think it won't be the end of that lively conversation about Harry and Meghan. But just before we move on and speak to the Foreign Secretary, you won't be surprised to know we've been keeping a very close eye on the moon mission, if you've been watching in the last few weeks. NASA's Artemis project. Who could forget the joy on the face of the NASA engineer, Howard Hugh, when we talked to him a couple of weeks ago? And the capsule is due to splash down today. So I wanted to show you what it might look like as it splashes back down to Earth. Next Sunday, we're hoping to check in with NASA again about what they've learnt during the mission on our last show of the year next week. But you'll be able to watch exactly what happens with the splashdown on the BBC and, of course, on the BBC website online when it all happens later today. Now, back down to earth. And what, if anything, is the government going to do about these strikes? Will they respond to Pat Cullen's challenge to talk to them? In recent weeks, we've heard from the Transport and the Health Secretary, and now here's the Foreign Secretary. We can see him there, James Cleverly, meeting President Zelensky on his visit to Kiev, and he is here in the studio with me this morning. Lovely to have you in. Let's start with the strikes, because we'll talk about your job as Foreign Secretary, but everybody is thinking what lies ahead at the moment. Now, we've heard very clearly from Pat Cullen this morning, get in the room and she will pause the strikes. Why don't you do that?
Well, the job of union leaders is to negotiate on behalf of their members. They do an incredibly important job, but they negotiate with their employers. And in this instance, the employer is the NHS. Now, throughout my time in politics, I've always been told that with things like the NHS and these kind of things, people want to take the politics out, which is why we have things like the Independent Pay Review Body. And suddenly now we're hearing that people want to bring the politics right back in.
Well, hang on, it's the Health Secretary's job to sort this out. And Steve Barclay himself is saying, I'd love to talk to the nurses, except he won't talk to them about pay. Now, shouldn't he just get on with it so the public can be spared and the NHS can be spared the disruption?
Well, Steve has spoken with union leaders. My understanding is that, including with Pat in the past. But ultimately, salary negotiations are done between union leaders on behalf of their members and their employer. And in this instance, the nurses' employer is the NHS. And of course, we massively value what medical professionals do. My mother was a midwife in the NHS throughout her whole working life. Like millions of people around the country, we've got close friends and family who are medical professionals. And we recognise the importance of what they do. But ultimately, we've got to make sure that we are good custodians of the public purse. And, as I say, the negotiations done between the unions and their employers.
But, Foreign Secretary, we've had the NHS director sitting in that chair a few minutes ago saying it's between the Health Secretary and the unions. We have the unions saying we want to be in a room with the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay. Steve Barclay himself has written about this question in the newspapers this morning. You can't sit there and say, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's between the NHS and the unions.
No.
That's not the case.
So
the
Steve has met, and he said that he has met and spoken with union leaders. He said he's willing to do so again. But we've put a process in place specifically for those salary negotiations for a reason. And the Independent Review Body has made a recommendation. The government has accepted it fully. And that, of course, means that there will be a significant increase in pay, particularly for those nurses at the start of their careers on lower salaries. There'll be a significant pay award. Now, we recognise how tough it is for everybody, medical professionals included. But we've got to make sure that we do this in a sustainable way.
But many people will think you have to make sure, actually, that the public and patients are spared disruption. The independent process is a process that just makes recommendations to the government. It is then up to ministers to decide what to do. Now, the process so far has clearly failed. There is no agreement. The boss of the Nurses Union has said on this programme this morning she would like to talk to the Health Secretary as soon as possible about pay. If he won't talk to her about pay, then bring in ACAS. Are you saying this morning that the government will not take up that offer?
Well, look, Steve has written a piece this morning saying that his door is open. We want to engage. We want to talk.
But will you talk about pay?
Look, I am not going to go further than Steve in terms of what he said. What he said was very, very clear. Of course, we want to engage. Of course, we want to get this resolved. The nurses and other medical professionals play an incredibly important role. That is why last year, when there was a moratorium on pay rises across the public sector, we did actually put forward a pay increase for nurses, which they would have received. We want to make sure that the NHS continues to be a high-functioning organisation, and Steve will speak. He said he will speak, but ultimately there is a system. I think we should respect that.
But will he speak about pay? Because if he will not speak about pay, then there will be disruption for millions of patients in the health service. And that could mean people suffering. You've heard loud and clear that you care very deeply about the NHS, you want it all to work out. But if the Health Secretary is not willing to discuss pay, as Pat Cullen has called for this morning, then there will be severe disruption to the NHS.
Well, the government has plans in place to try and minimise any disruption, but ultimately what we want to see is for us to get through what is going to be, and so Stephen made a really important point, this is going to be an incredibly tough winter for a whole load of reasons, including coronavirus and the backlog that caused, this kind of once-in-a-generation set of circumstances. We want to resolve that. We want to resolve that without strike action. Of course, as Steve said, we'll maintain an open door, but we do have processes for a reason, and I think stepping out of those, while sometimes seductive, I mean, ultimately, say these independent review bodies were created because there was a desire to depoliticise the negotiations around these things.
Okay, so as things stand, it doesn't sound like there's any way that these strikes are going to be called off, but I'm sure it'll be a very busy couple of days in the run-up to those strikes. Let's talk then about your role as Foreign Secretary. People here are, feeling the bitter cold. We know people in Ukraine are now freezing, and it appears one of the appalling tactics of Vladimir Putin is literally to try to freeze people into submission. But can Ukraine consider calling an end to the conflict as ceasefire if Russia does not carry out a complete withdrawal from its territory, including the parts that it took in 2014?
Well, look, I don't think it's right, even as a very, very good friend of the Ukrainians, and I think the UK is seen internationally as one of Ukraine's closest supporters, and that's certainly the vibe I got when I went to Kyiv a couple of weeks ago. But even as close as we are, I don't think it's right for the UK or indeed any other country to start dictating to the Ukrainians what the terms of a peace settlement might be. It's their country that was invaded. It's their sons and daughters who are being killed. It's their infrastructure, which is now civilian infrastructure, which is now being targeted. So ultimately, of course, we do want to see this resolved. We do want to see peace in Ukraine, but it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be an honest settlement, and I think Putin needs to come to the table in good faith, and I'm not sure he's there yet. But it also needs to be acceptable to the Ukrainians because they're the ones that have suffered. And
I hear what you say about not telling Ukraine what they should accept. But your predecessor as Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, did say explicitly that Ukraine could not accept anything that did not mean complete withdrawal, including Russia leaving those territories that they annexed and grabbed in 2014. So if you won't repeat that stance this morning, that sounds like a softening of the government's position.
Look, I get there is a desire to try and craft a narrative around this, but my position.
I'm not trying to craft a narrative. I'm trying to
my position has been clear on
how
this.
you might explain to the public how this awful conflict could end.
So for me, I think it's really straightforward. The message that we need to send across the whole globe is that aggression does not pay off. that you cannot benefit by brutalising your neighbour. The UN Charter is clear. The international humanitarian law exists for a reason, and the Ukrainians are defending not just their own homeland, but these really important international principles, which I'll be discussing tomorrow in the speech that I'm giving. And ultimately, Putin demonstrably being unsuccessful is really, really important. But as I say, I'm going to maintain the discipline that I set upon myself, which is not to dictate to the Ukrainians, even implicitly, about what the conditions would be. But it's clear that Putin has to be seen to have been unsuccessful in this attack.
And not just that, does he have to be seen to be held accountable? Do you think he should be tried at The Hague?
So there absolutely must be accountability. When I was over in Kyiv, I met with representatives of NGOs who talked to me about rape and sexual violence being used as a conscious weapon of war on the battlefield. Very credible allegations of children being forcibly removed from Ukraine and sent to Russia to be adopted. And there has to be accountability, and that means the soldiers on the ground who are perpetrating these atrocities, but accountability right up to the very top.
And does that mean Putin should be tried for war crimes?
Well, so in short answer, there has to be accountability, including Vladimir Putin. The mechanism by which we're doing that is one of these things that we will look at. We've been very supportive of the International Criminal Court, but we recognise there may be other vehicles, and we'll work with our friends, including the Ukrainians, in the international community to look about what an accountability framework an effective accountability framework would look like.
Do you worry, though, about where this might all end up? So the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, said yesterday there was a possibility that he worried about of a wider conflict between NATO and Russia. I mean, as our Foreign Secretary, is that on your mind?
Well, the point I would make is, Jens is someone I respect absolutely hugely. I've met with him on a number of occasions. Ultimately, we, NATO, have made it clear that we are a defensive alliance. NATO has never threatened Russia and is not doing so now. Vladimir Putin has tried to create this narrative, but the bottom line is countries that join NATO do voluntarily. There is no coercion, and the alliance is there to protect its member states, not to threaten anybody else. So there is no inherent need for NATO to be drawn into a conflict, and in fact we are trying to ensure that does not happen. But ultimately it's Vladimir Putin that's used the escalatory language. He's the one that's threatened further this imperial expansion, harking back to, I think Simon made reference to this, his focus on Russia's historical empire, and so it's him that's being the aggressor.
Is China a threat to this country?
Well, China is an incredibly challenging country on the international stage. It is potentially an important partner for good in areas like climate change, for example, but it has shown in a number of instances its behaviour is unacceptable. Its treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang, its refusal to abide by the things it signed up to with regard to Hong Kong, some of the things that it's doing in terms of international development. And so when we agree, we will look to work together. Where we disagree, we will make that clear as well.
But that is a slightly different message to something I just want to show our viewers that your boss, the Prime Minister, said in the summer, very explicitly, even had a snazzy graphic made up to say China is our #1 threat. Now, there are people in your own party on the backbenches who want to see you take a much tougher line on China. Is it still our #1 threat? Does that stand?
Well, what we, again, I don't want to give away too much of what I'm going to say tomorrow, but I'm going to make the point that actually we do need to think long term. We need to think long term about defending the principles and the institutions that we think, that we know have kept us safe in decades. And China, China has threatened a number of those foundation stones that we feel are important. And we will work with our old friends and new friends to make sure that we protect the things that we need to protect. But we will, of course, still look for opportunities to influence China to move in a better direction and also work with China to make improvements where we can.
Is there evidence of China trying to interfere in this country, though? Do you worry about what's happening on our soil?
Well, of course. I mean, my main focus, of course, is to look internationally, but work very, very closely with the Home Secretary about all the things where that interface between Home Affairs and Foreign Affairs. We have seen some really, really inappropriate behaviour, unacceptable behaviour in Manchester, for example. We called in senior Chinese officials to make it very, very clear how uncomfortable.
Show our viewers some of that. I think people were shocked to see this. So just if people hadn't followed this, in Manchester, some pro-democracy protesters outside the consulate there, having their banners taken down, and then, shockingly, one of them taken into the grounds of the consulate in Manchester and beaten up. Now, what have you done about that?
Well, as I say, we called in the most senior Chinese official in the UK to make it clear that this behaviour is unacceptable. We have said Greater Manchester Police have initiated an investigation. We are going to stick to a rule of law based process in response to this. When we get further information back from Manchester Police, we may choose to take
what more evidence do you need? I mean, that's happening on diplomatic territory in our country.
So one of the, and I know some people, some of my good friends in Parliament were keen for us to act immediately in response to just that video. The point I've made is in the UK, we abide by the rule of law. There is a process. Sometimes that is a little bit slower than some people would like, but it is professional and it's actually quite quick.
But there's a different diplomatic process, isn't there? I mean, shouldn't people be expelled from this country, diplomats, for being involved in that?
So our diplomatic decisions will always be based on the rule of law and due process. And there is a process in train. There is a process by which that is being professionally analysed by the Greater Manchester Police. We will listen to what they've got to say and we will make sure that our response is robust, but is demonstrably based on rules. Because that's what sets us apart from other countries in the world, is that we are a rules-based country and we stick to those rules.
But some people are concerned, though, about what China's doing here. And there have been reports also of secret police stations that China has operating, 3 of them in this country. Now, in some other countries, after those reports came forward, those were shut down. And when the US found Chinese nationals harassing their citizens, they prosecuted them. Ireland ordered those places to close. The Netherlands has done the same. What have you done? Have you doing enough?
Well, the Home Office is looking at those accusations. And again, we want to make sure that any decisions that we make, any actions that we take, are based on facts and are based on, as I say, those really important principles. And I know there is a desire to move quickly, and we will move quickly, but we've also got to make sure that we can demonstrate that we do it right, that we follow due process, that we abide by the law, because that is what sets us apart from some other countries around the world. And those are the values that we are seeking to defend, and the best way of defending them is by leading by example.
And I know you'll be talking about some of that in your speech tomorrow, but what is your guiding principle as Foreign Secretary? I mean, if New Labour had ethical foreign policy, you know, Theresa May used to talk about global Britain, Boris Johnson probably did global Britain with boosters. What's the Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly vision?
Well, I think Rishi, sorry, I've got to get out of the habit. The Prime Minister kept well, look, we the same intake. We're good friends, and I'm glad that I'm now having to get used to calling him Prime Minister rather than just Rishi. But I think one of the reasons he kept me in post is because we have a very, very similar view of the world and of international relations. The point that we are making, the point that I'm making, is that we have agency and influence on the world stage. We're not just commentators. We are active participants, and we have genuine influence. And we should use that influence to protect the values and principles that underpin our peace and security. That we should work with our long-standing partners, but also partners of the future. And we should think long-term, patient diplomacy, to make a real influence on the world stage, not just in the here and now, but for decades to come. OK, James Cleverly, you'll be making a big speech about that tomorrow, but I hope you come back to the studio very soon. But that's all we have time for at the moment. Thanks so much for coming in. Now, I wonder what you made of that on the strikes or any of the ideas about foreign policy. Let us know. You can do that in the usual ways by email, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. You know by now we do read your emails. We sometimes even ask your questions. And if you want analysis of what's been happening on the programme this morning, you can go to the BBC website. There is the address, bbc.co.uk/news. I think you probably know that by now.
Now, the story of the moment, of course, is those strikes, particularly in the NHS, which we've been discussing. The man who wants to be Labour's Health Secretary if they win the election is Wes Streeting, and he's here with us this morning. Great to have you in the studio.
Good morning. I'm glad you didn't say next Health Secretary, because we go through them so regularly. You can never guarantee that will be the case.
Well, who knows? Who knows what will happen next? There's always unpredictability in British politics, isn't there? Would nurses and ambulance workers be striking if there was a Labour government?
No, I don't think they would, not least given we've had this 11th hour intervention from the Royal College of Nursing and Unison saying if the government agrees to talk, to negotiate, there will be no strikes this week. Now, I think that is an offer too good to refuse, and I cannot understand why James Cleverly just sat in this chair a moment ago, refusing that reasonable offer, but perhaps worse still, pretending that government doesn't have a role to play. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, but there's a problem to be solved. Don't ask me. I'm just a government minister. I'm just here for the government car, the red box and the parties at number 10.
So if you were the Health Secretary, though, Wes Streeting, would you pay the nurses more? Would you give them more? We'd
certainly be prepared to talk about pay, terms and conditions and the way that the whole pay review body process works. I think that the staff who are going on strike feel their backs are against the wall. Yes, it's about pay and the cost of living pressures. We understand that.
Would you give them more money?
They do. We'd be willing to talk. But what I'm not going to do, Laura, at this stage is create hostage to fortune for a Labour government that, let's assume elections in 2 years' time. The worst thing I could possibly do this morning is make promises we can't keep, because when I come on programmes like yours and I say things like we're going to deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history or fund mental health, it's because I can be confident of delivering it. So I'm not going to make promises I can't keep, plucking things out of thin air, but I would be prepared to negotiate if we were in government today.
But hang on.
And I think that's the least we could expect of the government.
You've very strongly criticised the government for not talking to them about pay. Then you said, well, you would talk to them about pay, but we all know what they want is more pay, and you don't seem able to say that you would be willing to contemplate the idea of more pay.
No, I said I'd be willing to negotiate, and I think that's reasonable. But what I'm not going to do, Laura, is pluck a figure out of thin air.
Not asking you for a figure, I'm asking you for an answer.
We'd certainly be willing, we'd be willing to talk about it, and I think that's what the government should do as well. Not least because, of course, there are wider issues in the NHS, and the message I get from staff who are going on strike is it's not just about their pay, it's about the wider conditions they're working in, the moral injury they feel. But I'm worried about retention, and we are seeing staff leave the NHS, particularly lower paid staff in those lower paid bands who are going to work in retail because they think they can get better wages and less stress in their life. And we've got to deal with those issues.
And if you want to keep staff, Wes Streeting, that presumably does mean, and I know you don't want to give us a figure, and that's fair enough, but if you want to keep staff, that means being willing to pay them more, doesn't it?
Well, that's what the last Labour government did. And do you know why we were able to do that? Because we had growth in the economy, because we didn't have inflation running at the level today.
Would do
it would certainly be.
Of
course, we want to invest more in our public services. Of course, we want people to be paid more. The best thing that we can do to make sure we're able to do that is to get inflation under control, to get growth back in the economy. Because if the economy had grown under this Conservative government at the rate it grew under the last Labour government, there would be £30 billion to spend in public services without having to raise a single rate of taxation. And that's the cost of the Conservatives.
Well, you would say that, but let's stick on what's happening with the Health Service and what you might do if you did become Health Secretary. Because it's interesting, as a Labour politician, you've got your own beef with the unions, and you've used some pretty punchy language this morning about the Doctors' Union, the BMA. You said that they're maddening because when you want to talk about GPs, you get criticised. Why are you trying to wind the unions up?
Well, I'm certainly not. And in fact, I've just said I think they're being very reasonable, the ones that are planning to go on strike and even at this late stage are desperately seeking a deal. I think that's
maddening.
The BMA have driven me up the wall, and I'll tell you why. Because I announced the biggest expansion of the NHS staff in history, funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status, which would mean more doctors, more nurses, more health visitors, more district nurses. And all I said was that alongside that investment in staff, we've got to have better service for patients. It's not right that people have to wait on the phone at 8 a.m. in the morning trying to get through to a GP. People should be able to book appointments online. They should be able to see a doctor face-to-face. They should be able to see the same doctor. They should have continuity of care. And look, I appreciate the pressure that GPs are under. I'm not bashing GPs, but when I say I'm going to invest in the workforce, I don't expect the BMA to come out and treat me like some sort of heretic because I'm demanding demanding better standards for patients. And I do understand the pressures the NHS is under. I take my hat off to staff, including those who saved my life last year when I was going through kidney cancer. I don't blame them for the crisis in the NHS, but when a Labour government is putting extra investment in, it's reasonable for us to expect better standards for patients too.
And when you said also that the NHS needs to reform or die, I mean, what do you mean by that? I mean, I know you're interested in bringing more technology into the NHS, but maybe is the braver question to ask whether the NHS actually, with all our demographic problems, ageing population, increasing demand, does the NHS actually need to think about doing less, but doing it well, rather than being stretched so thinly and trying to give everything to everybody that they need?
So I'd agree with you in terms of the diagnosis of the challenge, but not the answer. So let me explain why I'm so anxious about the future of the NHS. We've got the biggest crisis in the NHS's history today, record waiting lists, people waiting long for care, ambulances taking even an hour for heart attack and stroke victims. But we've also got the big challenges of chronic disease, ageing population. So against the backdrop where we spend a significant proportion of our GDP and public spending in the NHS, we've got to ask questions about how that money is spent. So when you compare the NHS to other OECD countries, we're spending far more in hospitals on late diagnosis and therefore less effective and more expensive treatment. If we had more of that resource in primary care, community services, mental health, social care, we can deliver better outcomes for patients and better value for the taxpayer. So those are the changes I want to see if we're to defend an NHS free at the point of use, which I'm absolutely committed to. Because when I went through kidney cancer last year, against everything else I had to worry about, the one thing I didn't have to worry about was the bill. And I'm determined to uphold that founding equitable principle that the NHS has been based on for nearly 75 years.
But you're also talking, Wes Streeting, about using more the private sector more in the NHS. Now, there's a concern that when there aren't enough staff anywhere, if you just bring in the private sector, all you do is you move staff to somewhere else and you could actually make the problems worse.
Well, two things. One, we already have staff who do a significant amount of work in the private sector. I'm not talking about robbing Peter to pay Paul. I'm talking about dealing with the fact that there are empty beds available in the private sector. And perhaps worse still, we have a two-tier healthcare system in this country today, where those who can pay to go private and are seen faster, and those who can't afford to pay are left lagging behind. And I think that is deeply unfair. I would rather, as a short-term measure, use the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists faster at no cost to those people who can't afford private healthcare, at the same time as putting the investment we need to make the NHS fit the future. And that's what the last Labour government did, as well as delivering the lowest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in history. Use of the private sector fell under the last Labour government because we made the NHS so good that people didn't have to pay to go private.
But by bringing the private sector in, though, you are giving resource that would otherwise be going to the NHS to the private sector. And many people in your own party aren't OK with that.
I'm not OK with people waiting months, years in some cases for treatment. I'm not OK with people who are wealthy getting seen faster while people who are not wealthy are left lagging behind. That's not a Labour principle. That's not the Labour way. Our job is to get patients seen as fast as possible, and helping to alleviate some of that pressure on the NHS will help us to make the changes we need to make the NHS fit for the future. So yes, more investment going in terms of staff, because without a plan for the workforce, you don't have a plan for the NHS, but also thinking about where the money is spent, getting there earlier with faster treatment, faster diagnosis, better outcomes for patients, better value for money for the taxpayer.
But is it the Labour way to use the private sector more, to talk about making sure the NHS reforms or else it doesn't get the investment that it says that it needs? Is it the Labour way to talk about the BMA calling you a heretic and say that the union's driving you mad? I mean, I think there might be some of our viewers this morning, Wes Streeting, and some people are in your own party, listening to you this morning thinking, that sounds a bit like the kind of thing that a Conservative might say.
No, I'll tell you what the Conservatives will say. Not me, Gov, nothing to do with me. The problem's in the NHS. Oh, it's nothing to do with the government we've had in place for 12 years that took us into the pandemic with record NHS waiting lists, 100,000 NHS staff vacancies, 112,000 vacancies in social care. These absolute charlatans have left the NHS in the worst crisis in its history, and they have no answers. And I'm telling the government, by all means, nick Labour's policies. When I announced our NHS workforce plan, do you know who welcomed it? Jeremy Hunt, because he knows that workforce is the issue, and he says
because
the smart governments nick the best. And he says nick the best ideas of the opponents. That's what Jeremy Hunt should do.
We are out of time. It's great to have you in the studio, and I'm sure the next few months and years we'll have you in a lot to talk about your plans for the NHS. But thank you for being with us this morning. Now, our time together has raced through, and it's drawing to a close now, ahead of what could be a very tough few weeks for the country, with nurses going on strike. Let's hear again from a boss from the NHS about what that might mean for us all.
Well, we have been making progress in the backlog that was caused by the pandemic. We hit our first milestone of reducing waits below 2 years in the summer of this year. And our ambition is to reduce waiting times below 18 months by the spring. Now, of course, that could be knocked off course. Industrial action is one thing that could knock it off course.
Well, time for a last word with my very hard-working panel. Pat Cullen, you threw down the gauntlet to the government at the beginning of the programme. You then heard the Foreign Secretary's response to that. What's your response to him?
I did. And you know, if I had closed my eyes, I would have thought I was at a game of pass the parcel. Because it's not me, Gov. I'm not responsible. It's somebody else. It's somebody else. The bottom line is the government sets out the independent pay review body guidelines. It sets out the parameters in which they must operate, and those letters are a matter of record. You can read them. The one from Sajid Javid and the one this time from the current Health Secretary. So it has to be somebody's responsibility. It is the Health Secretary's responsibility to negotiate pay with me, or else through a conciliation through ACAS.
But listening to Wes Streeting, Pat, did you hear anything very different?
No, I didn't. I heard lots of promises about reform of the health service if they got in. The health service is constantly being reformed. Report after report after report. And why are those reports never implemented? Because we haven't the staff to implement them. Because we've 50,000 vacant nursing posts. We've over 100,000 vacancies. So it doesn't matter who comes into government and who provides another report. It will not happen if we don't retain our nursing staff.
Well, one of the reports was written actually by Stuart Rose, who's here. I mean, Stuart, you've been a boss of all sorts of things. If you were the boss of the health department, if you were Steve Barclay, would you be sitting down with Pat this week to try and sort this out?
Well, there's no substitute for talking, but just going back one place. I spoke to John Major 6 years ago and said to him, John, I'm not a politician, I'm a bit naive about these things. Tell me, this is a national institution, this is something which is in everybody's interest, this is something which we really have to get right. Why don't we have a cross-party commission? Why don't the Labour Party and the Conservatives and the Liberals all sit down and actually talk about how we're going to run the 21st century National Health Service?
And what did he say?
He said, Stuart, that's a great idea, but it'll never happen.
Well, I think with the health service, the very fact that the word heretic was used about reforming it shows what we're up against. But basically, the two parties are very similar, and both of them need to be honest about the compromises that are going to be necessary to make the NHS work. But I think, in terms of James Cleverly, who was very interesting about a lot of things, I think our reaction to Ukraine, our support for Ukraine, is something we can be proud of in this country, and we should be. I think we need to be a lot less naive about China, and we've been very naive, and we need to be a lot more vigilant. And lastly, what I think was missing from your conversation with him was Iran, which is now in alliance. The dictator there is now in alliance with Russia in a dictators' pact. And I think that the revolution in Iran needs a lot more coverage, a lot more honesty. The fact is, there's a strange sort of gingerness in a reluctance to really call the Iran regime a vicious dictatorship, which it is. And we need to support the young revolutionaries there. It's a lot more than just a revolution about women's rights as it's been presented. We need to support them. OK, well, it is extraordinary to see what's happening in that country, and hopefully before too long we will get to talk about it in the studio too. Thank you all so much for being with us this morning. Stuart Rose, Pat Cullen and Simon Sebag Montefiore. It's been great to have you. And that is it for this morning. And during the last hour, it seemed there was an offer put on the table on the upcoming nurses' strikes. You heard Pat Cullen from the RCN saying she wants to get back to the negotiating table and is open to giving some ground. But the Foreign Secretary, we heard, says the government are willing to talk, but won't right now negotiate further over pay. So on balance, it seems like the strikes this week will go ahead. And whether they do or not, Professor Steve Powis from the NHS said you should, of course, still use the health service this week if you need it.
But strike action could put the COVID recovery at risk, according to his view. This Christmas is going to be interrupted by strike action in many sectors, public and private. So there's going to be a lot of tricky days ahead. As ever, you can catch anything you missed this morning at any time on the iPlayer. But until next Sunday, goodbye.